How's it, my babes? You well? Welcome to the first ever How's It, My Babes book club. And I figured today we would try something out to see how you guys like it and see if it works. So I'm going to read you a story from Stephen King's Skeleton Crew, and the story's name is The Reaper's Image. So please make sure that you are in a safe environment. Do not listen to this while driving. Sit back, relax, pour your favorite anti-murder juice, and enjoy. The Reaper's Image. We moved it last year, and quite an operation it was too, Mr. Collins said as they mounted the stairs. Had to move it by hand, of course. No other way. We had it insured against accident with Lloyd's before we even took it out of the case in the drawing room. Only firm that would insure it for the sum we had in mind. Spangler said nothing. The man was a fool. Johnson Spangler had learned a long time ago that the only way to deal with a fool was to ignore him. Insured it for $250,000, Mr. Carlin resumed as they reached the second-floor landing. His mouth quirked in a half-bitter, half-humorous line. And a pretty penny it cost too. He was a little man, not quite fat, with rimless glasses and a tanned, bald head that shone like a varnished volleyball. A suit of armor guarding the mahogany shadows of the second-floor corridor stared at them as they walked past impassively. It was a long corridor, and Spangler eyed the walls and the hangings with a cool professional eye. Samuel Claggett had bought in copious quantities, but he had not bought well. Like so many self-made industry emperors of the late 1800s, he had been nothing more than a pawn-shop rooter masquerading in collector's clothing, a connoisseur of canvas monstrosities, trashy novels, and poetry collections in expensive cowhide bindings, and atrocious pieces of sculpture of all he which considered art. Here the walls are hung, no, festooned was perhaps a better word, with imitation Moroccan drapes, numberless and no doubt anonymous Madonnas holding numberless hallowed babes, while numberless angels fitted hither and thither in the background. Of course the old pirate had to come up with a few interesting items. The law of average demanded it, and if Samuel Claggett Memorial Private Museum guided tours on the hour, admission $1 for adults and 50 cents for children, nauseating, was 98% blatant junk, there was always the other 2%. Things like the Coombs long rifle over the hearth in the kitchen, the strange little camera obscura in the parlor, and of course, the De Iver looking-glass. The De Iver looking-glass was removed from downstairs after a rather unfortunate incident, Mr. Collins said abruptly, motivated apparently by a ghastly glaring portrait of no one in particular at the base of the next staircase. There had been others, harsh words and wild statements. But this was an attempt to actually destroy the mirror. A woman, a Miss Sandra Bates, came in with her rock in her pocket. Fortunately, her aim was bad and she only cracked the corner of the case. The mirror was unharmed. The Bates girl had a brother. No need to give me the dollar tour, Spangler said, quietly. I'm conversant with the history of the De Iver glass. Fascinating, isn't it? Collins said, with an odd, obscure look. There was an English duchess in 1709, and the Pennsylvania rug merchant in 1746, not to mention... I'm conversant with the history, Spangler repeated quietly. Yes, quite, Spangler said, in a softly contemptuous voice. He understood now that there would be no stopping Colin. He had a mind which was perfectly in tune with the time. Quiet. They climbed the third and fourth flight of stairs in silence. As they drew closer to the roof, the rambling structure, it became oppressively hot in the dark upper galleries. With the heat came a creeping stench that Spangler knew well, for he had spent most of his adult life working in it. The smell of long dead flies in shadowy corners, of wet rot and creeping wood lice behind the plaster. The smell of age. The smell was common to museums and mausoleums. He imagined much the same smell would arise from the grave of a girl, dead 40 years. Up here the relics were piled helter-skelter in true junk shop profusion. Mr. Carlin led Spangler through a maze of statutory framed splintered portraits, pompous gold-plated bird cages, and a dismembered skeleton of an ancient tandem bicycle. He led him to the far wall where the stepladder had been set up beneath a trapdoor to the ceiling, a dusty padlock hanging from the trap. Off to the left, an imitation Adonis stared at them pitilessly with blank pupilless eyes. One arm was outreached, and a yellow sign hung on the wrist which read, "Absolutely no admittance." Mr. Carlin produced a key ring from his jacket pocket, selected a key, and mounted the stepladder. He paused on the third rung, his bald head gleaming faintly in the shadows. "I don't like that mirror," he said. "I never did. I'm afraid to look into it. I'm afraid I might look into it and one day see what the rest of them saw." "They saw nothing but themselves," Spangler said. Mr. Carlin began to speak, stopped, shook his head, and fumbled above him, craning his neck to fit the key properly into the lock. "Should be replaced," he muttered. "It's damn." The lock sprung open suddenly and swung out of the hasp. Spangler caught it and looked up at him. He was clinging shakily to the top of the stepladder, face white in the brown semi-darkness. "You're nervous about it, aren't you?" Spangler said in a mildly wondering tone. Mr. Carlin said nothing. He seemed paralyzed. "Come down," Spangler said. "Please, before you fall." Carlin descended the ladder slowly, clinging to each rung like a man tottering over a bottomless chasm. When his feet touched the floor, he began to babble, as if the floor contained some current that had turned him on, like an electric light bulb. $250,000, he said. $250,000 worth of insurance for that thing. To take that thing from down there to up here, that goddamn thing. They had to rig a special block and tackle to get it into the gable storeroom up there. And I was hoping, almost praying, that someone's fingers would be slippery, that the rope would be the wrong test, and that thing would fall and shatter into a million pieces. "Facts," Spangler said. "Facts, Carlin. Not cheap paperback novels, not cheap tabloid stories or equally cheap horror movies. Facts. Number 1, John de Iver was an English craftsman of the Norman descent who made errors in what we call the Elizabethan period of England's history. His mirrors have become collector's items due principally to fine craftsmanship and to the fact that the form of crystal that was used had a mildly magnifying and distorting effect upon the eye of the beholder, a rather distinctive trademark.